Bonjour. How's everybody doing today? If you'll let me indulge for just a moment, I want to introduce myself in Ojibwe first. Gawina Pita Ninita Anishinaabe Mose, Ninga Anishinaabe Gakigit Ajina, Mark Felper, Nin Indigenous Cause, Shani Ashiman, Nimose Anini Idash, Nindigo Ojibwe one. Gawin Dikamasi and Dudain, Gawa Bubamika, Nin and Dunjaba, Ashkubak Zibin, Linda Nun. Many indigenous peoples have kind of traditions the way we introduce ourselves. And so what I did was greetings. I don't know a lot of Ojibwe, but I will try and speak a little bit of Ojibwe for you now. My English name is Mark Belcourt. My Indian name or Ojibwe name is Walking Man. I don't know my clan. I come from Wide Earth, but I live in St. Paul nowadays. So, okay. I'd like to thank all of our sponsors before we get started tonight. We have North Star STEM Alliance, College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resource Sciences, Office of Equity and Diversity, and the American Indian Studies Department. I first met Dr. Cajete about 8 years ago at the American Indian Science and Engineering Society National Conference in Albuquerque. As usual, I was kind of running late and for a banquet, and by the time I got there, a colleague had saved a seat for me. And but I missed the introductions. Didn't know who was all at the table. After the program, I asked my colleague, actually, my colleague's here, Jim Rock, back there. And I said, who was that guy across the table? He had some interesting ideas. And he said, oh, you don't know who that was? That's Dr. Gregory Cajete. It's like, oh, okay. So I went back, when I came back to Minnesota, I looked him up on the internet, and of course then I had to go out and buy a lot of his books. And so I've got 3 of the books here, so if after the lecture people are interested and they would like to see a little, or come up and check them out, the titles and things like that, feel free to do so. 4 years later, when I was getting ready to do my dissertation, which was going to be a series of interviews with Native Americans in science, I thought, what the heck, I'll take a chance. So I sent an email to Dr. Cajete and asked him if he'd be willing to be interviewed. And kind of surprised me. He said, sure, yes, let's do it. So we scheduled a 1-hour appointment. I went down to Albuquerque. We sat down, we started talking for a while. After a while, I kind of noticed Dr. Cajete was looking up at the clock a little bit. And all of a sudden I realized, oh, we've been talking for 2 hours already. Kind of went over our time. And he needed to get ready for a class that he was teaching, a graduate level class in teaching science to Native Americans. And so he said, do you want to come and sit in a class with me? So I did. So I got to spend a pretty good chunk of the day with him. Ultimately, in my dissertation, he became the most cited author and subject in my dissertation. So you see his name quite a bit in there. I think for that reason, that his work has become the core of a lot of my own personal beliefs and a lot of the things that I teach in class. So I just wanted to kind of take a quick moment and just kind of publicly thank Dr. Cajete for sharing his wisdom with me and to offer some tobacco for helping. Dr. Cajete has written 5 books altogether, written or edited, and again I showed you 3 of them here. He's got a couple more as well. He's the Director of American Indian Studies and Professor of Education in the College of Education at the University of New Mexico. His areas of expertise are practices in teaching Native Americans, epistemologies, and teaching Indigenous worldviews of ecology and science. He's a frequent speaker and presenter at professional meetings and conferences, and he often consults them with tribal colleges and other universities. The title of tonight's talk is Recreating Sustainable Indigenous Communities in an Environmentally Compromised 21st Century. Please welcome Dr. Tewa.
Tamo, as we say in my language, and I'm not sure if can you hear me? Okay. I'm not sure if the mic is on. Okay, now it's on. So in any case, it's really a pleasure to be here once again to give you, I hope, some food for thought in regard to rebuilding Indigenous communities in the 21st century world. Among my people, we have a lot of linguistic terms that I think really describe the kinds of things that are important to us and why we do what we do. And many times we end or begin a gathering like this with the terms or the word which has a variety of different kinds of meanings and different contexts in which it's used. But essentially, its basic meaning is be with life, be with life. And it's as much an epistemology, a statement of epistemology, as it is a greeting, if you will. Because in doing that act of being with life, that engages a variety of different kinds of thinking and doing processes that really bring you into the moment, into the space that Indian people talk about, that space of a very reflective, very respectful, very aware understanding of where you are and why you are in the place that you are. And so I use that word often to sort of begin this kind of a presentation, because I think that for me that's one of the reasons why I teach, and in many ways one of the reasons why I explore the subject matter that I explore in my various books, such as Native Science and the People's Ecology and Igniting the Sparkle and Spirit of the Game, and my first book, which was Look to the Mountain, an Ecology of Indigenous Education. That epistemology, or that metaphor, I think begs the question of what does it mean to be with life? What does it mean to be with life? What is the epistemological, existential meaning of that phrase and of that meaning? And it's interesting when you study Indigenous language. I'm fluent in my language as well, and I took my language for granted largely. It really wasn't until I later in life, and I think more particularly when I started to really explore Indigenous epistemologies, that I began to realize how amazing my own language was in its ability to describe very complex processes and descriptive understandings of natural processes that took pages and pages to describe in terms of Western text, but many times were embodied in just a phrase like being with life, or be with life. And so I'm really just really honored to have the opportunity to sort of present these thoughts and these perspectives before you today, to give you, I hope, some insights into what I hope can be some possibilities for the future in terms of education, in terms of ways of understanding ourselves in new and evolving relationships during this tenuous time of global change, social change, and one would say maybe even spiritual evolution or transformation. Because we certainly find ourselves in a very unique time and place in human history when kinds of things that we do now almost at every level, whether it's personal or communal, has an impact and is immediately registered in some very interesting ways, both positively and negatively, in, if you will, the world mind, the world consciousness. So let me backtrack a little bit and sort of context both this talk and my own work. I began my career as a teacher about 35 years ago when I was asked to teach at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And at that time I was asked by the president of the school to actually create a curriculum that integrated science with art, with the cultural perspectives of the students that were attending the Institute at that time. And the Institute basically is a Bureau of Indian Affairs post-secondary school that we would call a tribal college today, that was particularly created to bring Native students from throughout the United States and give them an education based on the arts. And in and of itself, it was a very new and innovative kind of education curriculum, even within the Bureau of Indian Affairs system. And in that context, I was allowed to, and also in a sense challenged, to create this curriculum that integrated science with art and the cultural perspectives of the students that were at the Institute. And I'm working on that assignment still, 35 years ago. At that time, we didn't even know what a culturally responsive curriculum meant in science. It largely did not exist. A few dissertations were written by a few Native scholars, Ralph Casebolt and Albert Snow, who reflected on the possibilities of using cultural content to convey science in some more meaningful and more relevant ways to Native students. But largely speaking, no curriculum existed that actually delivered those ideas in a practical, direct way into the classroom, and certainly within the context of students' learning. And so I was faced with a very interesting and unique challenge to actually create a model of education that could actually encompass all of the Native ways of knowing in a way, in a respectful way, an appropriate way, and presented, integrated with some of the ideas of art and cultural perspective in a way that made sense to students. And so a lot of the work that I did, and also did for my dissertation, which is Igniting the Sparkle, is would be called a curriculum dissertation, and it basically outlined the kinds of understandings and perspectives that I gained and actually created, outlined the model that I created, while at the Institute of American Indian Arts. But even after the dissertation, I realized that I was coming from a certain place, and I was coming from a certain philosophical understanding of the world that I needed to articulate. And that articulation really had to happen if I were to continue this kind of work in a realistic way. And so I backtracked and I began to really examine in depth the implicit understandings, the epistemologies, if you will, that I was coming from, that were embedded in the curriculum work that I had done. And that led to my other book, which I don't have with me, called Look to the Mountain, an Ecology of Indigenous Education, which is really an exploration of epistemologies. of Native people and really begging the question, what is Indigenous education? What are its cultural manifestations? What are its philosophical underpinnings? At that time, I happened on a very old translation of a Nahuatl poem by Miguel Leon Portillo, who was a very accomplished philosopher and scholar who was working out of the University of Texas at Austin. And in the 1960s, he had written a book called Aztec Thought and Culture. And up until that time, very few, anything had been written of a philosophical nature, a serious philosophical nature that had any kind of perspectives related to Indigenous thought. So he was one of the first ones who actually, took an Indigenous philosophy and really presented the essence of that philosophy in a way that not only was respectful, but that was rigorous in its treatment. And so, in that, he presented a poem that I found was kind of the essence of what I would consider Indigenous epistemology. And in those days, the people the Nahuatl people of Mexico, and more particularly the Aztecs, had these academies, not too dissimilar from our colleges and universities. One called Calmacac, and one was the college that was dedicated to the warriors, and which was a military school essentially, and the other one was the college that was dedicated to the arts and the sciences, primarily astronomy. And in that astronomy and art college, the professor would chant before his class his lesson and also his assignment. Okay, so you imagine me singing to you my talk, which I could do actually. to sing to you my talk. That was the form of discourse and oratory. So the question before that was being posed, and Miguel Leon Portillo was talking about, was this question of what is it to be a person of knowledge? What is it to be a person of knowledge? So he sings this challenge to the students. The students go off and probably came back a few days later and have their responsorial challenge, or the responsorial response to this question. And so what Portillo puts into the translated version of this in his book, Aztec Thought and Culture, is excerpts, bits and pieces of this translation of what the students responded. First they said that one must find one's face. Find one's face. To find face, using the metaphor of the language, is really to find one's true self, one's identity. Know thyself, that old adage, know thyself. Then they said, and they chanted, one must find one's heart, which is that desire that drives us to be and to do, our passionate self, our affective self. Then one must find one's foundation, which is today called vocation, that allows us to most completely express our heart and our face within the kind of work that we do, the 10,000 possibilities of work, as the Chinese say. And that was in relationship and responsibility. This is the key, relationship and responsibility. In relationship first of yourself to yourself to your family, yourself to your clan, yourself to your tribe, yourself to the place in which you live, and then find yourself to the whole cosmos. So there are these concentric rings of relationship and responsibility that ebb and flow around the finding of face, of heart, and the foundation. And that all of this was towards becoming complete as a man or as a woman, becoming complete as a man or as a woman. So the idea of becoming fully human was the real ultimate goal of finding face, finding heart, finding foundation. And so when I read that, I said to myself, that's it right there. That is in Tewa, we have ways of saying exactly the same thing. In Ojibwe, we have the same ways of saying exactly the same thing. In every indigenous culture and tradition, the epistemology talks about these things, these understandings of what it is to be a person of knowledge and a person that comes to knowledge. And so that then, created the foundation for this book called Look to the Mountain, an Ecology of Indigenous Education. And of course, native science followed that, and people's ecology, which is cultural traditions of food and sustainability, followed that. I served many roles at the Institute of American Indian Arts as the whole science department, and then later on as the chair of the cultural studies, and then later on as the dean of the Center for Research and Cultural Exchange. And then I moved to the University of New Mexico, where I entered the College of Education, started my work as a teacher educator, essentially, with a specialty in Native education and science education. And about 8 years ago, I was offered the opportunity to do yet another thing, and that was to create a new kind of expression of a Native Studies program, which I'm continuing to do today as the Director of Native Studies. So the long story short is that these are the events, among many other things that I've left out, that bring me to this place at this time in doing this presentation. In the work that I'm currently doing as the Director of Native Studies, I'm again initiating, very much as I did at the Institute, a kind of grand experiment to, in a sense, take a standing Native Studies program and reform it in a different kind of way, based on my understandings of Indigenous thinking and epistemology as it is evolving in a contemporary context. And so part of this presentation today is about that kind of research, how I'm evolving this thinking with regard to creating a community-based Native Studies program at the University of New Mexico, working with 125 majors and minors in my program, 5 full-time faculty, and a variety of adjuncts and other faculty that are working with us within the context of a population of 1,500 Native students attending the University of New Mexico, and within the context of Mexico, which itself is another circle, in that finding business. So, so it's really an exciting time, to be here to give you these thoughts and perspectives. One last thing before I go into the presentation, and that is that I've evolved. I've found, this finding face business is a continuing process. You go through different stages of the findings. The finding the face, the finding the part, the finding the foundation, and all of these concentric rings that you can imagine that you're never really completely there, because you're always going through different parts of that circling or cycling process at different times in your life, given the events of your life and the kinds of influences that you have in your life. So we're never done. We're never fully complete as human beings. We're always in the process of becoming fully human beings. And so that business of being with life, is a very appropriate kind of reading, because it acknowledges that you are a human being in the process of being human. It's a continual evolution. And so, today I've moved through, defining myself in different ways in a professional way. I would now say that I'm kind of what would be called a fourth world Indigenous scholar, fourth world Indigenous scholar. And what I mean by that is that the work that I'm doing now really deals with the work that many Indigenous scholars are doing all over the world, where they are Indigenous people coming from Indigenous traditions and community, having cycled through, in a sense, the Western academic system and tradition, and are now in positions to begin to do research in Indigenous themes, Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous understandings towards Indigenous goals. And so fourth world scholars, and Linda Smith also uses this word, the fourth world scholar, are in a sense creating themselves in this role, in the work that they do, wherever they do it, in whatever fields they do it in. So I'm declaring that's basically what I do, fourth world Indigenous scholar. So this work is the kind of work that evolves from fourth world Indigenous scholarly thinking. And I want to characterize it that way very specifically. We've moved through what we call critical theory as being one of our mainstays, and critical theory certainly has been and is and continues to be very useful to us as Indigenous scholars. But the question remains is, then what is Indigenous scholarship? And what are the Indigenous roots of scholarship? So when you go back to this metaphor that I gave about Portillo's translation of that Nahuatl poem, that also intimates a kind of scholarship, you see. A kind of methodology as well as a kind of scholarship that one involves himself with when one declares that you are a fourth world scholar. So you remember that term. Rebuilding sustainable Indigenous communities. Because one of the intimations of that metaphor also deals with circles of community. Circles of community. And so today we understand really community in a variety of different ways. There's a variety of different kinds of definitions of community. For Indigenous people, evolving their thinking and reclaiming their traditions of scholarship, if you will. Community means a very particular kind of thing, and communities really are the foundation of our ability we feel, to continue ourselves as traditional people, or as communities, or as distinct identities in the world. And so rebuilding sustainable Indigenous communities is a theme of kinds of research that Native people are doing. And I want to bring your attention to the 1,000-year-old Anasazi plate. And if you look very closely at that plate, you'll see that it's really not two images, but it's one image. The human being that's presented and the sandhill crane that's represented are not two designs, but they're just one. They are intimately intertwined in terms of the design structure, but it's also a representation of, again, an aspect of Indigenous epistemology, in which the statement that is being made by this anonymous scholar of art, if you will, I wouldn't say scholar, but maker of art, is that we are the sandhill crane and the sandhill crane is us. That we cannot divide up, the two being with life, that these entities are a part of that. We are the sandhill crane and the sandhill crane is us. It's the idea of interdependence and interrelationship that's being represented in this 1,000-year-old play. So that's kind of the context of this Indigenous thinking, as it evolves, as Indigenous scholarship. The first salmon ceremony, and I'll go into a sequence of exemplifications of how Indigenous thinking around these kinds of interdependent relationships evolve in different tribes and different traditions. Among the peoples of the Northwest, you have the tradition of the first salmon ceremony, where the first salmon are greeted ritualistically, and also that the stories surrounding the coming of the first salmon reflect on how you maintain your proper relationship and responsibility to one of these important sources of life among the people. How you treat it, how you fish for it, how you deposit its bones or redeposit its bones after you have taken of its life. How you celebrate it, how you art it, how you talk about it, and how you are being with life with it. And so all of the kinds of things and understandings and perspectives of the complex of this interrelationship, just as that plate that I showed you prior to this would also have a story and stories that are part of this understanding of relationship of the people to the sandhill crane. The sandhill crane was and is a very important animal. It comes to southern New Mexico, incidentally, where the Mimbres people are. So it's not uncommon to see sandhill cranes there. And the people had a very special relationship with that bird, that migratory bird. And so likewise, the people of the Northwest have that special relationship with the salmon that are commemorated in that first salmon ceremony. It's really also the knowledge base and the stories associated with that, the rituals that are associated with that, also help you to remember your relationship and responsibility, that ensure that resource continues, to be a resource for the people's life through time and through generations. And so you find many examples of that. The Plains relationship with the buffalo, the Ojibwe relationship with people here in the Great Lakes, and the relationship with wild rice. And wherever you go in the indigenous world, you're going to find that indigenous people embody their special relationships of finding face and finding art and finding foundation with the stories they tell about those things that give them life, those sources of life. This is the 1992 October edition cover of National Geographic. And this is the edition that sort of depicted the state of America before Columbus, for the kinds of traditions and cultures that existed in North America. I like this particular painting by an Iroquois artist that for me again depicts in more of a contemporary sense this understanding of interdependence and interrelationship, the story complex of Turtle Island, and what I also bring out in my books, a kind of spiritual ecology that informs indigenous thinking about relationship and relationality over time. So recreating indigenous education, was one of the tasks of Fourth World scholarship, in that we're beginning to examine how we can actually go about not so much going back to the past, but using the past as inspiration for the present and the future. That there are principles and understandings and perspectives that we practiced and in many cases still practice today, that we need to go back to, not only to relearn, but to reintegrate into our society and our thinking in contemporary ways, because they are also the foundation for our ability to sustain our community in the present and also into the future. So teaching and learning, which is transformative and anticipates change and innovation, becomes one of the mantras of this kind of educational perspective. Indigenous education that integrates and can integrate and apply principles of sustainability along with appropriate traditional environmental knowledge is one of the tasks. Finding ways to bring those traditions of environmental understanding those principles of environmental sustainability into a context that has meaningful and relevance and application in today's world becomes one of the most important kinds of tasks that we have before us. Indigenous education, we feel, forms the foundation for community renewal and revitalization. And in all of its expressions, whether it's in the rural community or in the urban community. And so I think those are the kinds of things that, for me, are embodied in this particular painting of the spirit warrior, if you will, the embodiment of that spiritual ecology, that place that we're attempting to get into. I use variations of Turtle Island, the concept of Turtle Island. In this particular art presentation, art sculpture, Turtle Island is really represented as a metaphor for the whole being of the earth, of which we all cultures, all human cultures, essentially ride the turtle's back. And all of our actions, all of our thoughts, all of our feelings are registered in the context of her great being, if you will, of her great consciousness. And it's a concept similar to the Gaia hypothesis that Lovelock, sort of moved forward in the 60s. That the Greek mythic tradition also presents, as well as many other mythic traditions around the world. The idea or concept that the Earth is really this great conscious mega being, and we are its children. That we ride the great turtle's back. And she registers our thoughts, our feelings, our consciousness. And so those ideas that we are all related, that we are those members of Turtle Island, I think also become part of the conceptual framework of Fourth World scholarship, because Fourth World scholarship really encompasses the indigenous world that is all over the world. Okay, so this idea of indigeneity to the earth itself becomes a kind of thing that is not only studied and reflected on, but it's something that has some practical applications in our way of thinking about education in today's world. One of the most difficult things that's taking place, I think, everywhere in almost every context is taking a look at our own complicity in the status quo. And so I make the statement that as concerned people, we have to take a long, hard look and honest look at the current educational, economic, governmental, and community development policies, planning, and processes, which many times makes us complicit with the status quo. The status quo meaning basically leaving things as they are. As I said, at no other time and place and time, at no other time have we been challenged to really question these complicities. We're in the throes of an economic crisis. I believe we're in the throes of both, also an educational crisis, a governmental crisis, a community crisis as well. That we still don't have not only a real understanding of, but we still don't have the strategies to deal with. And these are strategies because these are very complex, evolving systems, social as well as, and they have different components to them, that we don't have a kind of educational process or even a consciousness many times to deal with anything more than just parts of the issue. And so in many ways we're having to relearn how to deal with large system breakdown. And what happens when whole systems go awry because they're so interconnected. When one part goes, simultaneously everything else begins to go almost in succession, and also expands mathematically, essentially. So complicity, I mean, and that's a big issue, and I think we're all in those kinds of stages. You know, for me as a director of a Native Studies program right now, that question I've had to look at in terms of how to create a new kind of Native Studies program, a new generation of Native Studies that is predicated on guiding Native students towards a vision of health, hope and health, renewed and revitalized, sustainable, and economically viable Indigenous communities. Again, going back to the pedagogy of community and understanding that our communities are in great need of understanding, healing, and rebuilding, revitalization. And I mean all human communities, but more particularly Native communities, because these are the ones that are under great stress right now, extremely. They are, in a sense, the canaries in the cage. And how well they fare, how well we're able to work with them, also determines, in many cases, how well we're able to reestablish health across the continuum of communities. So the whole concept of community, human community, I think has to come now to the forefront of all kinds and all forms of education, whether they are science, or economics, or histories, or educational perspectives, that unless we begin to understand the systems that these knowledge bases operate around and through, we don't have, I think, much chance of really creating viable and sustainable solutions to the issues we face. So I think those are the imperatives. In the Southwest, we have a long tradition of community. There's a reason we're called Pueblo Indians. Pueblo Indians meaning basically these guys live in communities, home communities. That's not to say that the other tribes didn't live in communities either, but for us, we were very pronounced, town dwellers essentially. So the idea of community has always been a part of our tradition, and the realization that community mattered and was the most important component of who we are as people. So when you're beginning to take a look at how do you do scholarship, how do you come to understand how to work to rebuild Indigenous communities, one of the things that you begin to start with is take a look at its inherent ecological integrity, starting from the premise that what you do has integrity and also honors life-giving relationship. The reason we use the word being with life is as a greeting, but also as an epistemology, is because it is the human community and its evolution and its development and its structure that ensures human life. That's the key understanding. It's the understanding that human communities ensure human life. And that understanding is very deeply learned and certainly practiced within Indigenous communities because we understand that as kind of a guiding principle. So understanding that, that there is an ecology of community and then also that sustainability is a question of constant work. That you build in whatever you do a process that sustains community and culture in place in some shape or form. And that creates a consciousness of kinds of infrastructures and kinds of things that we do in education or research or scholarship or community development that allows you, I think, to understand that those things are essentially the endpoints, the goals, the ultimate goals. That everything that you do has vision and purpose, or should have vision and purpose towards that end. See that what you can do in light of revitalization of community. So when you use the metaphor of community, the community then becomes the driver of the research paradigm, if you will, the research enterprise. In many ways, as I'll say in the next slide, the medium and the message of the whole research enterprise in the first place. So for us as Pueblo people, we began as extended communities, extended families, which then gradually formed into clan groups, and those clan groups then coalesced into large towns, as you see in the form of Clara Pueblo, which is a contemporary Pueblo community. And those ideas that are represented in ecological integrity, sustainable orientation, vision, and purpose were understandings that were set into play in those communities. We have to understand that everything has spiritual purpose, and this is difficult in the Western context of research to understand and apply because of the separation that tends to happen in Western thinking about religion, particularly as an institution and other institutions. But for Native people, spiritual purpose is an integral part of the thinking and understandings that are associated with this kind of thinking. So cultural integration, revolves around that kind of spiritual purpose. And it becomes a way of understanding your actions, understanding that your actions originate through spiritual agency and stem from connections to a cultural way of being. It revolves around an ethic of respect for all, that actions stem from respect for and celebration of community, and that engaging participation of community becomes one of the most important aspects of the development process, the evolution process, the sustaining process that we set in play with regard to community. So this is where I say the community is both the medium and the beneficiary of the activities that you engender in it. This whole business of relationship or relationality comes into play as well. That building upon and extending relationships are an essential process of any kind of development process. Restoring and extending the health of the community is really the key goal, the end product, and the reason for doing the research. And that the initiative needs to always should always generate dynamic and creative process. That it is a creative process that generates other creative process, that generates other creative process. That it's a spiral kind of process in terms of an ongoing regenerative type of thinking and consciousness around doing research and working community. That it requires commitment, to developing the necessary skills, commitment to community renewal and revitalization, a commitment to mutual reciprocal action, and transformative change. So these are the purposes for which a curriculum of this sort, of this kind of community sustaining, community building would lead towards. This is what we would hope that students involved with this kind of work would inherently soak up, if you will, as a part of their commitment and a part of their work in this kind of arena. This kind of the woman is Akama woman very happily winnowing her blue corn kernels in the wind to get rid of the shade. But in many ways, it's also for me the commitment to do the necessary kind of work to process this kind of curriculum in a way that works for the communities. Among my people, we have this saying, "Hun indak inu, hun indak inu." We are all but kernels on the same corn cob. And it's a way of saying we are all the same people, we are all of the same corn cob, we are all of the same community. We have a community relationship with each other. So that you see in each of these kernels of corn, there's an individual kernel that's different in terms of color, shape, and hue. And its characteristic is that it leans up against another kernel of corn. And in biology, we call this unity and diversity. Each kernel is a unique individual. It's a kernel of corn, but it's a part of a larger corn cob, a community. And it's the corn cob that makes the corn. Basically, it's the seeds, that create the corn plants, but it's the corn cob that holds the seeds in place, so that they can evolve and gestate into reproducible kernels of corn. So this idea of we are all kernel, we are all corn. The other way to say this is we are all corn, home in my language, which means we are all but corn. And those metaphors again are whole epistemologies. In indigenous language that I speak in Tewa, that's a whole epistemology. That's telling you are a member of a community, you are an individual, but yet you have a relationship and responsibility on that corn cob. And through time and through your presence on that corn cob, you have an important role to play. And your purpose is to learn what that role is and how to execute it in ways that support the corn cob. So many times and during August, after we've gone through various dances that celebrate the corn in its various stages of development. We have these grand corn dances that you'll see usually in the beginning of May, late May, and going on into September. Different stages of corn are celebrated. So this idea of corn and dancing the corn, where the two moieties made up of many clans get together and do corn dances in celebration of their community and their membership on the corn cob, so to speak. Celebrate also the life of the community and the life that corn brings to us, and that metaphor of community is reinforced by the community dances that we perform. So those principles include that we share on place-based complex adaptive systems of knowledge called traditional environmental knowledge, this resourcefulness, industriousness, the collaboration and cooperation, integrating difference in political organization, alliances and confederation building, trade and exchange. These are things that indigenous communities have always practiced, and they're mechanisms which ensure that communities are always evolving and developing. And challenges, of course, are many when it comes to indigenous sustainability. Challenges may include things like establishing political self-determination, which is one of the important goals and processes that we attempt to effect, in order to maintain, the integrity of our communities. An ongoing process of decolonization, creating culturally responsive education that works for us. These are challenges as well. Challenges that deal with economic exploitation in many forms, diverse and competing ideologies that have taken hold within our communities that can and do tend to break communities apart or bring them into conflict with each other. Just need for political restructuring of various forms that allow us to create political structures that work for us, rather than work against us. Just the increasing individual diversity, identity redefinition, and the creation of formal and informal institutions that work towards this goal of community building, rather than community negating, and understanding, the difference between the two becomes, a major revelation as well. Those are the kinds of challenges, that this kind of curriculum of community, if you will, faces. It includes also challenges that are social, political, and spiritual fragmentation, challenges that are the challenges of creating formal and informal institutions which advance sustainability. As Native people, we're creating forms of our own indigenous education, charter schools. We have created tribal colleges. We've created Native studies programs. We've created a whole variety of kinds of educational structures that we hope will work for us, many of which are not structures that we created, but structures that we've attempted to adapt ourselves to. And we're, I think, now just beginning to create structures that we actually can say we've created these structures. And so we're still very much in that process of creating our own structures, rather than adapting to others that are in place. Not that that's wrong, but certainly it's part of the enterprise. Flowing with the complexity and the differentiation, not getting stuck in one place in time, but rather being able to flow as you do this kind of community building. Very much like natural communities flow as weather patterns change, as plant communities evolve and go from one stage of the development to another. And of course, political restructuring is always something that is key and necessary. Now, you may notice that some of the slides that I'm showing you are kind of metaphoric slides. This one is the Hopi farmer whose technology of creating a corn plant that has its root structure that runs deep into the caliche, or clay that's in the arroyo bed where it's planted. That's equivalent many times to twice its actual length. That gets its root structure down into that water-bearing soil. Is one of the forms of native science, one of the many forms of native science that allows us to adapt to a variety of different kinds of environments and still thrive in those environments. And of course, these are some of the kinds of practices that are traditional farmers, such as this old farmer from Clara Pueblo does as about begins this time of year as we begin to turn the soils and begin to clean the ditches and begin to the process of reawakening the soil and the earth before we plant the and all the ceremonies and dances that are being performed now are meant to honor the deer and the animals that we hunt and have given us life to this point, and then awakening the earth before planting, and all of our ceremonies that are associated with that. So, these are the kinds of things that public communities are traditionally about. As we move through this cycle, configurations for sustainability, have included for us, largely still our extended families, our clan, and our tribe. Given the unique history of Pueblos in New Mexico, our ability to have survived both colonization and also Americanization, speaks well of that vitality of sustainability of our communities up until this time. There's some doubt about the next generation, but up until this time we've been able to do that. The communities in place and region that we live in, is something that is still held very strongly. We have political, social, professional organizations. We have co-ops and federations and societies that we formed over the years that can help us to reestablish these sustainability. And even the corporation can be sustainable if founded on principles of, say, sustainability. And here I'm not talking about the way GM is organized. Okay? Native people do understand the nature of corporation, but it's an indigenized form of understanding what a corporation does and what its function is. and why it exists. So these are the research areas of Fourth World Indigenous Scholars. It's not the only research area, but as it relates to community, these are the research areas that become important. They include things like indigenous food traditions, the nature of indigenous families and the issues of indigenous families, indigenous community, indigenous relationship, indigenous health, indigenous education. These are the research revolves around all of the things that make and keep communities viable through time and through generations. And again, it's that principle of celebrating life, of being with life, of seeking life, essentially, in all its forms and all its manifestations. As we many times say, we are all kernels in the same basket, that we all share the common human fate, the common human dilemma of how do we identify ourselves as human in the form of relationship within a community through time. And so our ideas and our perspectives, are like those kernels of corn, all of which have potential for the birth of a new corn plant, but require nurturing and require nourishment, and require water, and require tending because of that special relationship humans have with the corn plant and the corn spirit. So I leave you with those thoughts, as you begin to think about this presentation or this talk, this understanding of what it is to be an indigenous scholar, which is really what I've tried to context. Because I think that a lot of times I go out and I give this presentation, and there's the expectation, even among my own native scholar, some of my own native scholar colleagues, that the presentation should be on Western academic scholarly, how should I say, as a Western academic scholar paradigm. And I decidedly departed from that in a variety of ways. But then again, not departed from that. But I'm sort of giving you a different kind of context or flavor of what indigenous scholars like myself are doing. The community piece is something that I think we're relearning. At the University of New Mexico, we are, as I said, attempting to create a different kind of Native Studies program. It's a very basic experiment that is still in its very early stages of development. We are attempting to give our students a firm understanding of research skills, a deep understanding of the issues of Native people in a variety of those areas like economics, health, education, politics. We're trying to give our students experience in understanding how to cast an argument and present that argument in the form of new media, in print, in digital, in presentations like this, in PowerPoint. And we're trying to give our students experience in real life work within Indian communities or organizations, helping them understand how to do and create their own research based on issues that are of interest to them. And now also introducing courses that are meant to help them understand the nature and essence of leadership, and also of strategies and perspectives in community development, community organization, and then also including skills of how to teach these skills to others in communities, so that those now define us as a community-based Native Studies program, attempting to address some of the issues that I've just presented. So I sort of present that to you, as food for thought, as you begin to, as we all begin to, I think, rethink what we're doing here. Many times I think, what are we doing here? And I think those are issues that have to be answered. Those are questions that have to be answered in some very important and direct ways. So this is my attempt to answer that question for myself and for the work and the students that I'm involved with. So with that, I thank you. We kum da'an, as we say. We thank you. It's not only that I thank you, it's we, my community, who I'm one of those kernels of that corn cob, who represents that corn cob. Thanks you for your time and for your thoughts. And so with that, I leave it open, and I thank you again for this time to share these thoughts. And it's open for questions now, which I hope are many. Yes?
Do you sing to your students?
Yes, but they don't like my voice. So I say, well, you think you can do better. Go ahead. It's in a formal, in the more formal traditional community, when we sing our songs, get our people ready for, our young people ready for the dances, those songs are actually teaching, so being sung to them. So yes, in that context, I do sing. But not to my students, but to my people, as we prepare to dance. Yes?
Are you finding that your students, when they leave you and go out and become teachers, are they using this model? And are you familiar with any good Indigenous educational programs that you would say have a grasp of this model?
Well, I think that because we're really ourselves just starting it. I think there's bits and pieces out there. I think our students use a lot of the repertoire. We really are graduating our 100th student this May from our program. And this is the first class of students that I think that has, because our curriculum was evolving as we were graduating students, so this is the first group of students that's going to be interesting to follow, to see how much they actually apply these understandings in the context of the work that they end up doing, whether it's, and many of them are still going on for a graduate degree, but just as many are stopping out and working for organizations or the community. So we're trying to put into play a kind of good tracking process, interviews and that sort of thing to help our students so we can understand what the effects are in terms of our program or our model. So when I'm saying to you that it's new enough so that it still remains to be seen, I anticipate just from the students' reaction that they're thirsty for this, that they've made the commitments necessary. They're very versed now in research skills that I would say many of them have equivalent skills to graduate students at an undergraduate level in research. And then their articulation skills have really developed so that they have presentation skills that are comparable to the research skills. I can't think but that they're going to have a lot of people, once people realize, communities and tribes realize how talented they are, that they're going to be hired, and that we'll begin to see some real and interesting kinds of changes. The leadership pieces we just worked into curriculum in the last few semesters, and then the community development pieces have always been implicit, but now we're making them explicit by creating courses that actually embody some of these principles that they've been using through other courses, other classes. So I guess my answer to you is that we're still in that process, becoming. Yes.
I just have two questions. You know, this Van Jones was here last week, the green jobs, not jails.
Oh yeah.
And I'm wondering, is this the mainstreaming of green, is that helping, supporting what you're doing? Are there some critiques that are missing from that whole discussion? And then also, my second question was, being that you all are closer to the U.S.-Mexico border, are you all also doing like transnational sort of indigenous networking with like indigenous communities in Mexico or Bolivia or some other places? And how does that sort of fit into the programs you all are doing in your curriculum in terms of?
I know that Van Jones, well, to answer your first question, I know that Van Jones has used some examples from indigenous communities as models, if you will, to begin to build a sustainable green workforce from. I think a lot of the work that he's doing parallels these same thoughts, but are much more urban-based, which I think are essential and are needed in the context of this kind of work. This is the work that this is based on is it's primarily Pueblo and also Southwest Native communities that are pretty have been in their places that have a land base. Have been in their places for at least since the Americans took over in 1848. So that they're a little bit more stable in terms of land base and the rural and their orientation. So we haven't worked on the urban one yet, because most of our students actually still do come from reservation-based Pueblo communities, small communities. Although we have a growing number of urban students having grown up in urban settings. So for me, to move this to the next level, or not really to the next level, but to be inclusive of the broader, expanding scope of Native experience, there needs to be an urban version of this kind of work, this kind of curriculum that encompasses those needs and that. It's about 65 to 70% of the standing Native population of the United States is now become urban, as an urban-based population. So more and more that's a key. But I have to say what you saw in my beginnings, because that's my orientation. I'm coming from that community, that kind of understanding of community. In terms of and the second question was again?
The transnational. Migration.
I would say yes and no. I think because we're still just working, as I answered to the other question, we're just still working out the bugs from this basic seminal attempt, at community-based participatory research orientations to Native studies that we haven't gone beyond our communities of service, which are surrounding Pueblos, the Navajo Reservation, to Apache reservations. The transnational problem is certainly also it's a problem primarily because of language, I think, and I think those are the kinds of issues that we're going to. We do a lot of work with indigenous populations in Central and South America and Mexico. In Mexico, they have this the new cultural universities, as they call them, that have evolved, which are parallels to our tribal colleges here in the United States. They're situated in large indigenous population areas. And so they're experimenting some of the kinds of structures that tribal colleges have utilized. So that's one way we're working with students. But the whole problem of the border, is there for us, and it's very hard for Indigenous students from Indigenous communities to get across that border, legally. It's true, and so we unless we are specifically bringing students from those Indigenous universities into our universities as exchange students for a period of time, they generally don't have a chance to get across that border. So yeah, we're dealing with all of those kinds of things. So as you can see, it's we haven't arrived. We're just starting to get on canoe. It would be canoe here.
I found myself tacitly assuming that the majority of your students are native. I'm wondering if you've had non-native students in the program.
Oh yeah. But there's probably fewer than in most Native Studies programs. The majority of our students are 75%, Pueblo and Navajo. The majority are Navajo, and secondarily are Pueblo, and then other tribes another 10%, and then another 15%, I'd say, and then maybe about 5% are non-native students. Usually from the East Coast, or from California. That's where our students that are non-native are coming from. The students that are Anglo from New Mexico don't tend to take our classes, which is of concern to me because, our history and the community, the history of those communities that we're dealing with, and the kinds of population that our students are going to have to deal with when they work with their communities and try to establish relationships with the non-native communities that surround them will be the students that are not taking courses. So we're probably going to try to find ways to bring, and like you, we have an ongoing huge amount of native related courses that are open to in other. So these are Native Studies courses, but actually the courses that are being offered by anthropology and history and psychology and biology, they have a larger number of non-native students in those classes, and they're being taken for elective credit, the various student programs. So native students non-native students are still getting some of those. But sometimes not as in an intense way as they would in one of our courses. So those are still issues, yeah, we've still got to work out.
You talked about teaching and learning is transformative and anticipating change in relation. Could you talk a little bit more about that, what you really meant by that, maybe some of the processes?
A lot of our conversation over these last 2 days has really been about how to change the curriculum so that it becomes that transformative. I think it really is about going back to some very basic understandings of what it is to educate, for finding face, finding heart, finding foundation, to actually turn those metaphors into operational paradigms, curricular paradigms, and the way that you approach helping students understand themselves in relationship to the environment, in relationship to other cultures, helping them understand the nature of the kind of work that they are doing, want to do, helping them to understand something of the empathy and affective nature of the work that they're doing. That I think inherently transforms the individual to begin to think and have a different kind of consciousness about what they do and how they teach and all those kinds of things that I think are important, for that kind of transformation. transformation at the level of the university really deals with how, as I said, in many ways, this Native Studies curriculum is a transformative curriculum because it's different than other Native Studies programs that are based on another kind of curricular paradigm. So we're transforming how we understand the enterprise of doing Native Studies. So those are the ways that, in other words, when I'm saying that the change happens in very particular kinds of things that you do to changing and adjusting the curriculum, creating new courses, actively engaging students in a much more participatory kind of research process. All of those are transformational and change details. We work that out course by course, student by student. And that's where the transformation begins to. Someone had a question back there?
Oh, if you don't mind if I could add something to your answer. When we were here last about sort of green jobs, green economy, is like locally the Honor the Earth, which is the nonprofit that Winona Duke is the executive director of, is kind of like partnering with the White Earth Land Recovery Project on the White Earth Reservation. Sort of like, you know, she has this kind of like a green economy for brown people concept. And a lot of the sort of like local activism that's happening about green jobs right now is, a lot of it's focused in South Minneapolis, which is the largest urban concentration of Native people in the country. And so there are kind of like a lot of local indigenous organizations that are involved in sort of the movement to get some of these dollars in the stimulus package that are for green jobs into like urban Native communities. You know, Higher Minnesota is health infrastructure, renewable energy of Minnesota, sort of like a kind of a coalition of a bunch of different groups, and they had a meeting 2 weeks ago at the Indian Center where there were hundreds and hundreds of people. There's sort of things happening about kind of like connecting the social justice, environmental movement, green job stuff with existing indigenous organizations, both in like urban Minneapolis and in rural Minnesota.
I'm glad you brought up with Winona, with your good friend. That's exactly the good example of taking some of these ideas that I just presented and sort of transforming them into a real life action process that, in this case, has effect both in the rural community as well as the urban community. That's possibilities. So that's the kind of creativity that you would hope for, that this kind of scholarship and community development initiative will bring about. And so, that's one of the best examples, I think. What indigenous people are doing around this paradigm. See, what I'm presenting to you is in my language, from my perspective, a paradigm that lots of indigenous scholars are doing and applying in useful ways that they find meaningful to them in the context of their communities.
I sort of had a question. With transformations, word came up is, and I didn't hear you articulate it, but the whole idea of the mestizaje.
Yeah.
I mean, Chicano Studies talks about it a little bit. I thought you were sort of getting into it because it becomes an either-or choice versus, Cajete.
Yeah.
I mean, that says it all right there when you say it. And so there's no that crossover in terms of, well, how does a mestizo deal with all of this?
Yeah.
And when you raised the question about the Southwest,
Yeah.
I mean that is really a whole mestizaje taking place.
Yeah. The history.
It's like we admit it that's happening in Mexico, but we don't admit it when it's happening here.
Yeah.
Kind of a thing. So I was just wondering how
It's
I mean,
not
wrapping your academic
It's an interesting issue in New Mexico because of its unique history. I'm being asked to write the Pueblo perspective of the 400th anniversary of Santa Fe. And that's a bold task on my part because in order to do that, you see how the history of New Mexico is really an integrated, intermingled indigenous Hispano history through time.
Because when I was reading the article where it said 700 well, Nahuatl-speaking people came to Santa Fe. They're the ones who established Santa Fe. There's only 200 or 300 Spaniards.
It was probably even more than that. Yeah, it's an interesting kind of situation. At the University of New Mexico, we've had a lot of issues around the Chicano study program has not fared as well as the native studies program, although I can't say we fared well. Truthfully, but I mean, we fared a little better than the Chicano studies program because of exactly this issue. You know, here's the native Chicano New Mexico population, largely of whom do not admit to their indigenous ancestry, which is Pueblo, first of all, which is Navajo, Apache, and Comanche. And that's the majority of the Hispano population in New Mexico, even today. But that's been a kind of, it's been such an issue to admit that very, very few will admit that. So you have the influx now of really people from Mexico, you know, into the service jobs. Not only people from Mexico, but Central and South America as well. And so here's an immigrant population into New Mexico, and so the native New Mexicans have had big issues with with immigrant Hispanos, you know. But the large Hispano influx into New Mexico is also indigenous, but they're coming from those indigenous roots. And so, and then there's this whole issue of the pure Hispanic, the founding families of New Mexico, which itself is exactly. So our program right now, and a good friend of mine, we all get along, the directors of the studies programs, is called the Mexicano Hispano Chicano Studies, or Chicano Mexicano Hispano Studies, CHM. Because they couldn't agree on the intercontinental. And so, my friend, I don't know how to tell you what to do, because that's an issue of how do you coexist with these differing viewpoints of yourself and your identity. We do have many Chicano students that take our classes for their own purposes, and the CHM department is trying to evolve a similar curriculum to this one. But it's going to take some time. And part of the issue is this issue. So that's the way I would answer it. So right now we're looking at how can we serve the Pueblos as they exist and identify themselves, the Navajo Nation, the chapters of the Navajo Nation as they exist and identify themselves, and the two Apache tribes.
We're running out of time now, but I'd like to invite us to continue this conversation out in the fall. We've got some hors d'oeuvres, desserts, and beverages. We can continue to talk to Dr. Cajete, talk with each other, have our own community out in the hall.
Thank you. It's been a really give you some sustenance, you know, for the long, cold nights in Minnesota.